right, Mary, if you would call the roll, we'll bring the May 19th meeting of the Board of Harbor Commissioners to order.
Frank Kelly.
Here.
Betsy Kramer. Here. Will Anakushin. Here. Corey Bantalan. Here. Eric Friedman. Here. Jim Sloan. Here. Bill Spicer. Here.
A full house. So, Mr. Bridley, are there any changes to the agenda?
Mr. Chair, no changes this evening.
Okay, this is the time we would take public comment on any item which is not on the normal agenda. Okay, so let's go for an approval of the minutes for the April 21st meeting. Is there a motion to approve? Okay, Commissioner Sloan, a second?
I'll second.
All right, any discussion? All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Approved. The department update, director's report.
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, I don't really have anything other than the council action items that have gone onto the City Council since your last meeting. One which you are very familiar with, that was the changes to the commercial fishing policy that we made at the last meeting. The second one is our annual water quality contract with SAIC, Science Application International Corporation, who does that for us. And that was approved by City Council also. And we'll cover the June item under the end of the meeting between staff and commission as to whether or not that'll take place next month.
All right, thank you, Mr. Bridley. Any comments or questions for Mr. Bridley? Then we're off to the business services report.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, good evening. Robin Kirkcaldy, doing business as the Dry Dock of Santa Barbara, has operated the dry dock boat maintenance facility in the harbor since approximately 1990, although the facility itself has been in the harbor since at least the early 70s. The facility consists of a dock system, a floating workshop and floating building, and a submersible boat hoist that's used to lift boats out of the water for maintenance purposes. In June of 2010, Mr. Kirkcaldy filed a voluntary Chapter 7 bankruptcy unbeknownst to the department. Mr. Kirkcaldy continued to pay rent and keep his insurance in force during this time, and the Waterfront Department became aware of this issue via a third party approximately October of 2010. The department was not listed as a creditor, and we were not contacted by the tenant or the bankruptcy court during this time. Sometime later, the bankruptcy was converted from a voluntary Chapter 7 to a Chapter 13 bankruptcy. In about April, Harbor Marine Works approached the bankruptcy trustee about purchasing the submersible boat hoist from the bankruptcy. And on April 26th, at a bankruptcy court hearing, the court agreed to allow the sale from the trustee of the boat hoist to Harbor Marine Works. And again, this was not brought to the attention of the Waterfront Department by either Harbor Marine Works or the bankruptcy court. We became aware of it through the harbor grapevine and through the former owner, Mr. Kirkcaldy. After learning about the forced sale of the boat hoist, the department served Mr. Kirkcaldy with a 30-day notice of termination of tenancy, which will go into effect on May 26th. Currently, the City Attorney's Office is in discussions with the bankruptcy trustee's lawyer about the process of reclaiming the site back for the Waterfront Department. And the site is simply 3,600 square feet approximately of water area off of F Finger. All the floating docks and buildings and so forth, and there are two boats there, those are all personal property of Mr. Kirkcaldy, and they're not city property. And so we need to figure out how we're going to get that out of there and get our water space back. And once we do, we're evaluating options for that space. That's one of the last buildable spaces in the harbor after having completed P Finger just recently with a modest expansion. We believe and have plans for putting 8 35-foot slips in that location as part of the Marina One reconstruction project in 2017. So given the recent developments and the coming anticipated availability of this water area, we've been having some discussions about how to speed up that process of constructing the slips and assigning them off the wait list, such as jumping ahead to F Finger or doing a change order on next year's N Finger project and adding some slips at that time. So we're evaluating different options on that. So that's the dry dock issue. I just wanted to come back to the Commission with our charter permit program and the changes that were made at the February Harbor Commission Charter Committee meeting and the full Harbor Commission meeting. And as the commissioners will recall, we made a few policy adjustments in terms of the wait list. It seemed like it was taking forever to get people through that wait list. So the commission agreed with the committee's recommendations to put some prerequisites on folks before they got on the wait list, that they needed to have a valid Coast Guard license and a slip in the harbor. As well as that, there was a $25 annual maintenance fee that was added to remain on the charter permit wait list. At that time, we had 21 people on the wait list, and I'm happy to report through this process we were able to offer 5 charter permits, 3 of which were declined, 2 of which were issued to Santa Barbara Sport Fishing charters, and I believe Marianne Schuyler of Delilah charters. And the remaining folks either were ineligible or dropped out. So our waiting list went from 21 to 3 in about 30 days. So we believe that was a successful endeavor with just some minor changes to the policy. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Any comments or questions for Scott? Commissioner Sloan.
Yeah, Scott, so what happened to the submersible hoist? Where did it go? What's Harbor Marine Works going to do with it? And then I have one other question on when do you think the timetable, when do you think you'll have a plan for what to do with F Finger and moving that timetable up?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Sloan, the dry dock was towed over to the travel lift pier, cut in half lengthwise, and hoisted one half at a time by the travel lift and hauled into the Harbor Marine Works yard, where I believe, last time I checked, it was being stored at the back of the yard. I don't know if it's still there or not. The boat yard is mentioned. They may have plans to ship it somewhere where there may be a demand for such things, but it's such an old piece of equipment, it's hard for us to imagine being worth shipping much of anywhere besides the Hegas landfill. But as far as your question on the timetable for building out the slips, we really haven't gotten that far. Carl and I have been going back and forth about what the best of, well, it's Carl's department, but as I mentioned, we have several options we can explore.
So do you think a month or two you might have a plan for that? I mean, just roughly, what's the time frame of putting that plan in place together?
Chairman Kelly and Commissioner Sloan, I'm going to be meeting with the president of the company that's building out the next couple of phases, and we'll talk about the feasibility of possibly a change order whereby we could initiate that improvement in the not-too-distant future, because we want to take advantage of the water space. It's Phase 8 of the project. We just finished Phase 2. So if we just follow the regular sequence, it'd be at least 5 years out. And also, we also have to talk to Department of Boating and Waterways about a modified scope of work and funding. So it's several months out, but if we are going to do it next year, we'll have to decide here pretty quickly and work out those issues. And we'd bring that back to the Commission, of course, as soon as possible.
Great, thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Kramer.
What are the requirements if a slipholder files for bankruptcy? It sounds as though you and the waterfront expected to be notified, or that you should have been notified. Is there some specification there for a slipholder if he files for bankruptcy?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Kramer, generally what happens in a landlord-tenant relationship, which would be analogous to a slipholder department relationship, usually the first indicator is they fall behind in the rent. And you get named as a creditor in the bankruptcy and notified by the bankruptcy, listed on the list of creditors, and you get a notice in the mail saying you're not going to get your rent, you're prevented, there's an automatic stay, you're not even allowed to ask for it. In this case, that didn't happen, and then you're usually provided with a form to apply for whatever nickels and dimes may be squeezed out of the debtor at the end of the bankruptcy proceeding. But usually that's what happens, is that the rent stops going first. It's highly unusual to keep getting the rent in a situation like this.
So there's nothing then in Chapter 17 as to what happens if a slipholder should file for bankruptcy or anything like that? I meant to look it up myself, but I didn't.
Commissioner, I don't believe there's anything in Chapter 17 of the Municipal Code on what happens, or in the slip permits. In the leases, in the default provision of waterfront leases, there's a provision that bankruptcy is a default of the lease, and the department may act on that default. But again, in almost all cases, the bankruptcy
I understand.
has the automatic stay, and you're prevented from collecting or evicting.
Understand, yeah. Well, thanks.
Commissioner Spicer.
Regarding the removal of the hoist, was there any waste or pollution issues that the waterfront hadn't been aware of when it was dragged out of there?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Spicer, they cleaned it up before they brought it over to the dock, put booms around it, and when they made some relatively minor cuts to split it in half, so there wasn't any sawdust released into the water or any hazardous paint waste or anything like that was released or anything unexpected like that.
Scott, I have one other question. It's a little unclear. So in Kirkcaldy's, does he owe the department any money? I would assume that if he did not, that's why we didn't get any kind of notification.
Chairman Kelly, he did not owe us any money throughout this process. When we became aware of it, we monitored the insurance to make sure that was still in force. And he was current until May 1st.
Okay.
And when the bill was received for May 1st, that's when we got the notice from the bankruptcy attorney saying, "Thou shalt not try and collect that."
Okay. Very good. Are there any other questions or comments? Okay. Thank you, Scott. And we're off to the Harbor Operations Report.
Good evening, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. Well, as promised, we held our 5th annual Operation Clean Sweep on Saturday, May 7th, and as expected, we had quite a haul. 35 volunteer divers and dock workers worked vigorously beneath A through D fingers on Marina One, and came up with a treasure trove of goodies, including steering wheels, cables, buckets, nets, chairs, carpet pipe, 1 toilet, and 3 marine batteries. And at the time of the writing of the staff report, that amounted to 2,500 pounds of debris. But what we also had was we had 13 lines tied to objects on the bottom that were too heavy to lift by volunteers in a safe manner. So what we did is we tied those off to the docks, to the hefty, beefy cleats on the docks, and let the tide do its job for us, and slowly over the next 3 days or so pulled some of the remaining debris out of the muck, and we got another 1,000 pounds of similar kind of stuff, including a paravane, what they call a flopper stopper, one of those boat steadier things, solid metal, off the bottom, and a lot of receivers, crab receivers and what have you. So we actually had 3,500 pounds of stuff, bringing our total to over 5 years to almost 19,000 pounds. And so one of the things I did notice this year, Mr. Chair, was people were really exuberant about it. We had representatives from NOAA and the Maritime Museum and Surfrider Foundation and every marine-oriented nonprofit you can imagine in town, as well as our local dive hull cleaner folks and our own maintenance staff, and they were all very, very excited about it. Carl's got a couple slides here to run through it. You can see this is one of those sort of chicken coop plastic receivers that fishermen use to keep their live lobsters and crab in, and sometimes they get too heavy and they break the line attaching them to the cleat. Sometimes they chafe off, but this is one of the more prolific items that we found on Operation Clean Sweep. Same thing here. This looks to us to be a shrimp receiver stacked in funnel forms. Some of the stuff was actually kind of curious from an archaeological standpoint, because it dates back many decades, and it was difficult, honestly, to tell what it was. That's sort of part of the fun, if you'll allow me. And this was about 2/3 through the event as the dumpster was starting to fill up. You can see it's a menagerie of all kinds of stuff. And then finally the quintessential group shot. Some folks were out eating lunch, and but this is, you can see city representatives there. You can see folks from all walks. And once again, I can't thank them enough for their volunteer spirit. They get paid a donut in the morning and a box lunch at 11:30, and they do this for 4 hours, and they do it with great joy. So we're very, very proud of this project. And next year we'll move out a couple more fingers on Marina One and continue our sojourn around the waterfront. As I've mentioned before, it's planned initially to be a 10-year project. We'll take a deep breath at that point and see if we want to do it again, and see where we're at. You know, hopefully we're at a maintenance level by 10 years from now, or 10 years total. The last of the sort of spring group of cruise ship visits rolled through on Mother's Day, May 8th. That was the Sapphire Princess. It was her 6th visit here, and we've had a very good luck with the Princess Lines. We've developed a very good relationship with them, and good communications and coordination with our I almost said hostility, our hospitality groups in town, and the ship's crew and our security folks at the designated secure facility over at Sea Landing. About 2,700 people plus a bunch of crew went ashore for walking tours and trolley tours. In fact, 725 of them went on trolley tours around town. They really had that on their mind, and they had, of course, all the brochures. These were pre-sign-ups on the ship. They signed up for these, and it went very smoothly. It was a crisp, clear, pretty breezy day, so I was kind of wondering how well the tenders would fare in that weather, and they did great. And we got great reviews from the ship's husbandry agent and the passengers. So that sort of wraps it up for the spring. As you know, in the transition seasons, we see a few more of these ships in the fall. We actually have 4 ship visits scheduled for the fall, 2 each from Crystal and Princess Lines. And we just found out that there may be a couple more lingering from Princess out there in the mist near the end of the year. So it'll probably be pretty much the fall, be pretty much like the spring. I think there'll be very little impact to the routines of the city, but there should be a great benefit to our local economy and the waterfront. And last month, Commissioner Friedman will recall this in particular, we just had a good discussion about Senate Bill 623, which aims to make it illegal to use copper, to sell boats with copper bottom paint after January 1st, 2015. And as promised, I told you I would update you on the course of that bill. I'll probably be doing so for a few months here until it either fails or flies. And it passed appropriations by a 5-to-1 margin, mostly along partisan lines, and is now headed to, it passed environmental quality and is now headed to appropriations. And predictably, the boating groups are starting to line up relative to this bill. And it's very interesting. Some of the boating groups are sort of, if you'll allow me, a knee-jerk response to, no, this can't be good. You're going to eliminate copper bottom paint. It's the only tried and true method of keeping, keeping fouling organisms off the boat. And they even noted that it's one of the primary means of keeping invasive species out of our harbors. On the other hand, the other groups have remained either neutral or taken a watch position. And the group to which the City of Santa Barbara belongs, the California Association of Harbor Masters and Port Captains, has done exactly that, taken a watch position. And our lobbyists and our legislative committee are working directly with the author in hopes of making some amendments that will make it more palatable to the boating industry. Primarily, those amendments, if they are to line up with amendments that were proposed for the bill that just passed in Washington, and I'll get to that in 1 second, in the state of Washington, will be to extend the deadline, hopefully past 2015, to allow more wiggle room to come up with, for the industry to come up with alternative paints that don't carry the biocidal action of copper, and also to possibly introduce some amendments, instead of eliminating copper, reducing copper to levels of insignificance relative to environmental harm. I expect those kind of negotiations to be taking place over the next few months. The author has extended her willingness to talk. She's been very open about her communications, and so we'll see where it goes from there. But meanwhile, on May 5th, the state of Washington, their governor signed into law a bill doing exactly what Senate Bill 623 proposes to do, prohibiting the sale of new boats with copper-based bottom paint on or after January 1st, 2018. So they stretched it, that 3 years that's on the table and being negotiated now relative to an amendment, and that no paint would more than 0.5% of copper would be used on recreational boats as of 2020. My guess is that's where the boating organizations will push. We'll have to see where it ends up relative to any kind of compromise or whether it flies on its own. And with that, I conclude my report. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mick. Any comments or questions for Mick? Commissioner Friedman.
I just want to say thank you for that update. And as this bill moves forward, if we can perhaps get a better understanding at future meetings of the city's legislative platform, specifically relating to water quality, and if this bill would tie into that, just have a little understanding of that and see from a commission perspective if it would be good to engage with the city council on this topic in the future. Last month it seemed like this bill was still kind of a placeholder, and it seems like it's gaining more steam as you indicated. So I appreciate you updating us and look forward to continuing this in the future.
Any other comments or questions? Commissioner Anakuchin.
Time for my usual apocrypha, I suppose. Not to belittle the considerable efforts that you go to clean up the harbor and volunteers that generously offer their time. In my few years of observing the human scene, I've come to the conclusion that with regard to littering and disposal of things in the ocean and in harbors, it's not the good people that do that. It's people that are careless or insouciant about disposing of trash. And an activity such as this, which is celebrated as an event, really doesn't pay much homage to the good people that didn't trash the place, but instead provides encouragement to those that do, because what the hey, Croneman and his people are going to come and clean it up anyway. Why should I worry? I think that's the reality. I have no suggestions for a solution to that, but I think that should be kept in mind when you plan programs that has a desired effect of getting a clean harbor bottom. What, besides taking all that stuff out, what can keep that stuff from ever getting in? The toilet bowls and the batteries didn't get too full and break the lines. So there are culprits here. Maybe we should seek them out.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Anakuchin, thank you for those comments, and I think they're well placed. Just one note on that. We're doing our very best to advance a culture of responsibility along with this program. We have since the beginning, and part of the message we try to get out through the visuals, through the descriptions, what have you, is that the ocean is not a trash can. And think of it as an open field of beautiful wildflowers. It was just full of trash. And we do our best. I couldn't agree with you more that scofflaws are going to be scofflaws. But we're not unaware of exactly what you're seeing. We're doing our best to advance the right notions.
That's good and well taken.
Any other comments or questions for Mick on this point? Mick, I have two quick ones for you. When a ship comes in for a visit, do the merchants get any advance warning whether the passengers plan to leave the area or stay in the Santa Barbara area?
Mr. Chair, I may be misunderstanding your question. Do you mean our local merchants at the harbor?
Yes.
Whether they plan to go away on trolleys?
I understand that one of the cruise ships recently came in, and quite a few of the people were bussed out of the area, and there were very, very few people that stayed in the local area.
I believe you may be referring to the Crystal visit of a couple of months ago. and that was a rather high-end tour where the folks had a great interest in seeing the wine country, and that was all prearranged. Typically, but no would be the answer, and if you wish to see a different modality, certainly let us know. But I think the norm is that most of the folks, especially on the Sapphire Princess cruises, which have been the most common, this is our 6th one, tend to stay in the area relative to Santa Barbara. But no, we had no means. I guess we really, quite frankly, didn't think of alerting the merchants to these people aren't staying here.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what mechanism I would use for that.
Okay. I just wanted to know if there was any way that we did know whether they were going to come or go. Because I did have a few people approach me and say, did you know? And I said, no, I don't know if we have a mechanism for knowing if they're coming or not. And then the second point has to do with the Copper Bottom study. I don't know exactly the dates when all of these things happened, but I just wanted to put it out. I remember reading a report on a vessel called a Pack Baroness that sank down inside somewhere off Point Conception, and part of its cargo was many tons of ball bearing size copper or something like that. And there was great concern as to what this was doing to the sea life on the ocean floor, and it was maybe 40 years or so before a robotic got to go down and make the unusual discovery. The answer is nothing. And so this huge leaching of concentrated copper being washed over had no effect, which I thought was very interesting in the report. And no one ever talks about that event, which is extraordinarily concentrated copper in one spot. And they expected to find a great plume of death, and there wasn't one at all. Just a comment.
Mr. Chair, I think your point is well taken. I'm familiar with some of the folks out of the Marine Science Institute who have been involved in the studies of the Pack Baroness, and contrary to some of those expectations, I think they found that, number one, and let me know if this is contrary to what you read, that the dilution factor was such that it was pretty hard to determine or detect with any kind of certainty what the impacts of that copper were. But I think you're right. I think as close as they could get to the ship and the species, and they did harvest species from there, they couldn't, and my phone will ring tomorrow if I'm wrong, but they couldn't detect with any certainty any environmental damage being done at that level.
Okay. Commissioner Anakuchin has a comment. Thank you.
The dilution of dissolved copper or lead or zinc or any other transition element has a necessary first step, and that's getting it dissolved. And that requires one to consider what the solubility of copper, lead, zinc, nickel, and so on is in seawater. I can't give you the exact number, but I can tell you it's exceedingly small. And so you have an element, a phase that is hardly dissolving in seawater, and what little is trying to establish equilibrium with that is swept away by currents and mixed with by turbulence and so on and taken out of the area. So it's not surprising, to me at any rate, that you would find very little effect. Now in the harbor, where circulation is a little more restricted, the dilution would be less, but not the solubility. It would remain the same. It would be very, very small still in the harbor. I can reiterate the anecdote that when I got off the boat in Lake Titicaca in South America, walking down the pier, I looked over the side and there was a marine battery, huge one, about 1 meter long, in clear water. There's a beautiful lake up there, and I thought, this is terrible. Yet I had one of the best fish meals I ever had in that little restaurant at the end of the pier there. I don't know whether the lead contributed to that or what. But.
Okay, thank you, Mick. Any other comments or questions for Mick? It's always colorful. Mick, I have to compliment you. I love that tie. That's absolutely great. It makes it. Okay, so we're off to the preliminary corrosion study of Santa Barbara Harbor.
Recommendation that Harbor Commission review and consider a preliminary corrosion study concerning electrolysis in Santa Barbara Harbor by Far West Corrosion Control Company.
Chairman Kelly and Commissioners, electrolysis is a term commonly used by boaters referring to corrosion of submerged metallic parts. More accurately, galvanic corrosion is a well-known process between dissimilar metals. Most boats have dissimilar metals underwater with props and prop shafts. Stray electrical current or stray current corrosion, sometimes referred to as a hot harbor, is a more destructive process and of great concern in any harbor. Ooh, I skipped a couple there. There we go. There's 4 components needed for corrosion. There's an anode, which is typically a zinc. Most boaters have zincs on the underwater metallic parts. The electrolyte is salt water itself. Cathode is either the shore ground system or another boat adjacent to it, and I'll talk more about these in a little bit. And a metallic bond is the ground wire. Every boat is hooked up to the shore power. There's a common ground wire, so all boats are essentially hooked up together. Most boats underwater should look like this. Nice, clean bronze propellers, stainless steel prop shafts, and the little donuts on there are zincs, sacrificial zinc anodes. When corrosion gets out of hand, galvanic corrosion or stray current corrosion, underwater metallic parts can look like this. This can be very costly. It is very costly, trust me. And it can be very dangerous in that through holes and other parts can corrode away, actually creating a hole in a boat, and boats can sink. This has been an issue in Santa Barbara Harbor since I've been here in 2004, and we always get complaints. It's very difficult to understand and diagnose. So in 2006, we took sort of a proactive effort to hire a sort of a self-proclaimed expert from Florida named Jim Schaefer, and we conducted a seminar in the harbor. We had 20 participants from ports and harbors all up and down the coast, and it was incredibly confusing. Everybody walked away without any sort of an understanding of what to do, how to diagnose problems, and how to move forward. A fortunate outcome is we were introduced to a marine electrician from Channel Islands Harbor that seemed to understand. So for the next several years, every time we had a problem, we would call this individual up, he'd come up, he'd diagnose it, recommend repairs, and we dealt with it that way. Fortunately for this individual, he retired in 2009 and moved to Mexico. Unfortunately for us, we weren't quite sure how to deal with future problems. Last fall, we had 3 things occur at once that really alarmed us and made us suspicious about potential for stray current corrosion. One was we installed a completely new AC electrical system in Marina One as part of the Marina One replacement project, Phase 1. As part of that project, we had 16 new freshwater systems that replaced the existing one, and all of them had these steel pipe collars, which are like pipe clamps. About 6 months after they were installed, half of them failed, all within about a week, and we got a little bit alarmed. At the same time, we had 3 cases of aluminum outdrives experiencing severe corrosion in a very short period of time. All this coincided at the same time, and trust me, the boat owners were quite concerned, and everybody was pointing the finger back at us. New electrical system, your water lines are failing, and so on and so forth. So we decided to hire a company called Far West Corrosion Company. They were referred to us by Danny Castagnola. He owns the 77-foot utility vessel, Danny C., well known. He's got a large steel boat, and he recommended these folks as being very experienced with corrosion, especially with metallic parts in the water. Their experience includes the cathodic protection dealing with this issue on the Queen Mary II, the Alaska pipeline, and offshore oil rigs. So we hired them in January to review our recent complaints and direct staff in diagnosing potential problems. They prepared a report, which is an attachment to my staff report this evening, and a couple things. It's pretty technical. This is a difficult subject, at least for me to understand, and I would recommend that the Commission, if you really want to get into the technical details, you review the report. There's definitions in it and an executive summary, so we tried to structure it to make it as understandable as possible, but this is a fairly difficult subject. First of all, the first incident that they addressed was the pipe collars. These are stainless steel 316 pipe collars that went over a rubber hose. These were all temporary installations with the ultimate replacement being part of the phase-by-phase replacement of each finger. Like I said, half of these failed in about a week, and they were quite difficult to replace. Fortunately, Far West Corrosion concluded that it was a unique type of corrosion called crevice corrosion, specific to stainless steel under certain conditions like these, and it had nothing to do with stray current or anything else, any problem with the harbor. We have since replaced all these with PVC, so now they appear to be quite reliable. The second issue is a little bit more involved. The AC electrical system for Marina One is rather large, 480 volts. There's miles of cables. We replaced just about all of it up to each of the transformers. There's 5 transformers in Marina One, and each transformer serves several different fingers. The key to diagnosing problems is to going to the transformers and opening them up and testing certain components. Far West and my staff work together to test specifically whether or not there's current on the ground wire in the transformers. Every transformer, every electrical system, AC electrical system, has a ground wire for safety reasons only. If there's a ground fault or what people call a short circuit, that current can flow back to ground, which is a copper rod right behind our building in the harbor, instead of electrifying the case and electrocuting people. The question was, is there any current on the ground wire? If there is, that's an indication that there's something wrong with the electrical system. We didn't detect large amounts of current, but we detected low amounts of current. Too low to trip breakers, but high enough to indicate a problem. And a problem with these lower levels of current are typically indicative of a problem with individual boats. The third element that they investigated was the outdrive corrosion. This is a typical outdrive that has been corroded. Most of them are aluminum. The majority of the unit itself is underwater in an electrolyte and quite vulnerable for galvanic corrosion or stray current corrosion. There's a couple of tests that Far West directed us to conduct on the shore power and a few other things to determine whether or not it could be a problem with individual boats. One is similar to the transformers. You can test the shore power at each boat. We have created a little pigtail that separates out the wires, and you can test the hot wire, the neutral wire, and the ground wire. And specifically the ground wire, once again, if there's current on it, it indicates there's a problem with the boat. There's a couple of different things to take into consideration. It could be from an adjacent boat, and this is a very important point to make. You can go and look at a boat and conclude that, hey, there's high current, but it may not be from that boat. It could be from the adjacent boat because they're all interconnected through the ground wire. And the other issue is that these only detect constant problems. Most boat facilities and fixtures operate intermittently. Bilge pumps come on periodically, refrigerators come on periodically. Very few things run constantly. So you kind of get a snapshot in time. It's helpful, it's a good test, but it's not terribly conclusive sometimes. The other test is called cell-to-cell potential, and this is something we can do from the dock or the back of a boat and gives an indication as to whether or not there's adequate cathodic protection or that the zincs that most boat owners put underneath the water are adequate. Potential indicates the adequacy of cathodic protection. Cathodic protection is a term you quite frequently hear when dealing with galvanic corrosion. And this test that we do at the dock really can only be done at the fuel cap. We use the fuel cap because most people assume it's bonded, grounded properly, because when you put fuel in, you're required to do that. But that's all the test we can really do. To really do an involved test, you have to hire a marine electrician and test all the metallic parts to get some sense as to whether or not there is adequate cathodic protection. Part of the report included a test form, and this test form includes the test results and is something we made available to the boaters that have an issue. This particular test form, for example, the highlighted sections are the results from an actual boat out in the harbor with pretty high levels of current on the ground wire on the shore power. There's just different notes that it says this is pretty high, you should deal with the boat owner and try and address it. As far as the cell-to-cell potential, same thing, fuel cap, you test the potential. There's indications as to whether or not it's adequate. The report recommends certain thresholds that are adequate, and if you don't meet those, then you really should do something and work with the boat owner. Speaking of working with the boat owner, part of the consultant's task was to create an evaluation guide that we would give to the boat owner along with these test forms so they can kind of understand what they're dealing with, especially if we have test results that indicate there's a problem. We would obviously encourage the boat owner to hire a marine electrician, test cell-to-cell potential on all the metallic fittings, check the wiring throughout the boat, and duplicate our tests with acceptable results. There's another option that they can do, and that's install an isolation transformer. This isolates the grounding system so that an individual boat is not connected to all the other boats and their potential problems. This is a common and acceptable remedy in some harbors. We actually had 3 individuals install these after the recent incident in the fall. They wanted to play it safe. So this is a common remedy, but it can also mask problems. The report concluded 3 basic things. The pipe collars were a result of crevice corrosion. The problem has since been corrected. The AC electrical system installed as part of the Marina Run replacement project was properly installed. There is an annual inspection required as part of our one of the loan terms from our Department of Boating and Waterways, and therefore we will go back annually, duplicate these tests to make sure that our system isn't part of the problem. And the outdrive corrosion of those 3 vessels, it was inconclusive as to the cause, mainly because they couldn't do any testing prior to the corrosion. The boats had been hauled out and repaired and put back in the water, and 2 of the boat owners installed an isolation transformer, so you really can't go back in time and determine what was wrong. We have since gone back and tested the boats, and there's no smoking gun to speak of. We will go ahead and forward the test results and the corrosion, the evaluation guide to them as a courtesy and work with those folks. Most importantly, Far West findings, they did not detect any stray current, and they concluded that Santa Barbara is not a hot harbor. One thing to keep in mind, there's several variables whenever you're talking about corrosion, especially stray current corrosion. The intermittent operation of electrical devices, the test may not identify a problem. There's a means of detecting problems, installing devices where they go 24/7 and you could pick up a problem if a bilge pump comes on. We don't have that capability right now. Grounding and bonding, it's very inconsistent from boat to boat. You assume all the underwater metallic parts are bonded, but that's clearly not the case. With 1,100 boats from, some probably 40, 50 years old, it really varies. And coatings is another variable that's quite important. The coatings is a really adequate way to provide cathodic protection, but it has to be applied properly. Environmental conditions, the right surface preparation. So all these things have to be done correctly to really protect underwater metallic parts. Since this has been a recurring problem, and we haven't really developed a program because we've been able to hire individuals in the past to deal with specific problems, we are considering developing an electrolysis program similar to what other harbors have, like Santa Cruz and some of the others. And some include testing every boat in the harbor to kind of get a baseline condition and find out if there are any boats that really have a problem that need to be dealt with right away. Based on the recent tests we've done, we've tested about 50 boats. There's a couple boats with problems, and we're going to have to deal with those boat owners to get them to correct those problems because they may be inducing problems on adjacent boats. It relies on voluntary correction of those problems. Non-cooperation requires an enforcement tool. In Santa Cruz Harbor, for example, they've gone beyond just slip rules and regulations requiring that boats be properly bonded and don't emit stray current, but it's in their municipal code. And we would possibly consider including a section on stray current corrosion, controlling it in Title 17 of the municipal code. That's down the line, but that's a direction we could possibly go. We could also install equipment to detect potential problems. They're quite expensive. And what they really do is you install them on a transformer and they give you an indication that a boat served by that transformer has a problem. Still requires going boat to boat and isolating that boat and working with that individual boater. In conclusion, we're pleased to announce that our system appears to be just fine, but there are problems with boats. And this is an expensive task for boaters to take on, especially most boaters go, the lights turn on, the refrigerator works. They would have no idea if there's a low current ground fault. But there are resources available to boaters to help them. First of all are indicator tests done by my staff. The 2 tests I talked about, the shore power cord and the cell-to-cell potential, can give them an indication that they're more or less okay or they've got a serious problem. And more importantly, there are certified technicians to deal with this. And a good resource is the American Boat and Yacht Council, ABYC, at abycinc.org. There's a laundry list of certified technicians for every boating system you can imagine. They really know this stuff. It is very complicated, and it really warrants hiring an expert in this field. So we've done our due diligence. We're think we are at least getting a handle on this issue, and we will proceed with developing a program at some level and probably come back to the Commission in 4 months or 6 months when we have a better understanding. And that concludes my presentation this evening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Carl. Any comments or questions for Carl? Commissioner Bantalin.
Thanks for that report, Carl. Did we get any complaints in any of the other marinas, or was it just Marina 1?
Chairman Kelly and Commissioner Bantalan, the report was based on the complaints in Marina 1, but we have gotten complaints in other marinas. We recently had a complaint in Marina 4. We've had complaints in Marina 3. So this is throughout the entire harbor. It's not just Marina 1 specific.
Okay, Commissioner Kramer.
I just want to thank you for that really good report. I had read carefully the staff report, but this made it much more clear, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Commissioner Anakuchin.
Yes, I agree. Thank you for that, Carl. My impression is that, and this is based on experience with electrical systems in the past, that chasing electrolysis problems is like herding cats. There are so many uncontrollable variables in the situation that you can spend an awful lot of time and money with not too terribly material results. And it's not hard to see why. As you point out, you can't monitor everybody all the time. And you should have to do that in order to isolate these problems. I wanted to ask for a clarification of your terminology. You were talking self-potential at some points. Do you refer to potential here as what, electromotive force or voltage, or how are you using that? And the term self-potential has very specific meanings regarding in electrolytic systems, and I wonder if you're using it in that sense or whether it was just a convenient way to describe some of these effects.
Chairman Kelly, Commissioner Anakuchin, at the risk of misstating exactly what it is, cell-to-cell potential is, I would request you refer to the report itself. I took this directly from the report, and my understanding of cell-to-cell potential is a good measurement of the adequacy of the cathodic protection. I couldn't tell you exactly what it means, how the ions flow, but it's an indicator test, just like the other one, just an indication that you are adequately protecting your underwater metallic fittings. The electromagnetic force, I really do not understand that. I'm sorry.
I had another comment, and that is in attacking such a problem with the boats, if it were my job, the first thing I would do would be separate all the aluminum-based problems from electrical problems, because aluminum in the ocean environment is more of a chemical problem than electrical. There are electrical effects because, well, there is electrochemistry no matter where you are, no matter what you do. You have different electrical potentials associated with a different chemical potential, so naturally with the sensitive enough equipment you can actually stick two electrodes in a reaction vessel and see the electrons moving around, which is what's happening in the ocean. The description of electrolysis is clarified somewhat by talking in terms of batteries, because everyone understands what a battery is, or do they? It's two dissimilar metals or two things with different chemical potential connected by an electrolyte, and now we're getting electrons shifted around, and there's a potential for completing a circuit and having electrons go all the way around. Well, this is what's happening not only just down a wire, this is happening in a field, three-dimensional field out there. So if you can focus on the fact that you're looking at a bunch of assorted batteries of all strength and size, connected every which way there is. That's more of a visual image of what's really in the water. So it doesn't help much, but it's sort of interesting to note.
Well, thank you for your comments. They're duly noted, and they do kind of emphasize the complexity of this issue. And you're right, aluminum is really vulnerable metal, and that's a good point. We'll take a close look at boats with lots of aluminum on them. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Any other comments or questions? Carl, I want to thank you for the report, and it is a complex issue, and I think rather than the board just say anything, we're going to leave this one in your in your capable hands. And that would take us up to the request for proposal.
Mr. Chair, before we get started on that one, just a comment, and I also appreciate Carl's ability to make something that is very complex somewhat understandable. The primary purpose of all this is that we had some suspicion. There was a lot of concern that with the new electrical system that went in with Marina One and our ongoing replacement of the dock fingers, that we couldn't be the source of electrolysis, and we couldn't be the ones that were causing boat owners to have problems with their outdrives or whatever it was. That was primary purpose, and that was the goal of this report, because we don't have the expertise to be able to tell everybody, don't worry about it, it's not a big deal, we're not the issue. We feel very comfortable, very confident now that we're in a defensible position. That's number one. We do know, however, that boats, individual boats, can be a cause of these electrolysis problems, and if it's going to continue to occur, and this has been going on in this harbor ever since I've been here and beyond, then we need to at least figure out a way that if we want to address it, we will. This is a beginning. It's not the end. It's maybe not even, it may just be that, a starting point. And we will continue to evaluate whether or not we do anything more than what we've done. But if there are continued complaints, there are continued boat owners that are being damaged, then we will most likely have to be a mediator of some type to figure out what we do next.
Understood. And that's why we're going to leave it with Carl. Okay.
Request for proposal 219G Stearns Wharf Coastal Cruise Concession. Recommendation that Harbor Commission consider the Selection Committee's review and analysis of the 3 business proposals received from Captain Don's Cruises, Santa Barbara Water Adventures, and Santa Barbara Water Taxi, LLC, for the coastal cruising business at 219G Stearns Wharf. B, accept the recommendation from the Selection Committee and make a finding that Santa Barbara Water Taxi, LLC, is the most responsive and appropriate lessee to revive the coastal cruising business on Stearns Wharf. And C, direct staff to negotiate a lease agreement with Santa Barbara Water Taxi, LLC, based on the business terms outlined in the RFP, and proceed to City Council for final approval.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, we've been discussing this at various meetings over various months, so I won't get into a lot of background here. I think everyone's well familiar with it. The current concessionaire on this wharf cruising concession is Captain Don's Pirate Cruises. The department is seeking a new operator for this business, or at a minimum, a business improvement plan from the existing operator. The original RFP process was initiated in November of 2010. A total of 6 responses to the first stage request for qualifications were received. The Selection Committee reviewed those and winnowed the 6 down to 2 finalists, which were Santa Barbara Water Taxi and Action Water Sports of Tahoe. These 2 were selected to be finalists and submit a more thorough business plan or request for proposals type response. Unfortunately, the proposals fell short of expectations due to one of the vessels was not Coast Guard certified, and it became apparent late in the process it would take quite a long time to get it Coast Guard certified to carry passengers for hire. And then the other proposal, again at the 11th hour, the engines proved not to be compliant enough with California Air Resources Board requirements to operate the kind of hours that they needed to operate to turn a profit. So the Commission directed staff to reissue the request for proposals to expedite as much as possible, and the RFP was reissued at the end of March with a deadline for responses of May 5th. 3 responses were received by the May 5th deadline. Captain Don's Cruises, the current concessionaire, submitted the one-page letter that's in your packet. However, the selection committee did not consider this responsive to the terms of the RFP. Santa Barbara Water Adventures has experience operating parasailing and boat tours in Lake Tahoe. They propose to operate initially with a 35-foot parasailing boat that they've already ordered for another business opportunity they're exploring in Marina del Rey, and also bring in a 35-foot sailboat for an interim period while they order a 54-foot sailing catamaran should they be awarded this lease. The proposed delivery date on that would be summer of 2012, next summer, on the larger sailing cat. And Santa Barbara Water Adventures also proposed to rent some relatively modest-sized power boats in the 23 to 27-foot length and rent those from Stearns Wharf. And the selection committee had some concerns with this proposal, including the concept of boat rentals based from Stearns Wharf. Santa Barbara Water Taxi has operated the water taxi service between the wharf and the harbor since 2003 aboard the 22-passenger Lil Toot. The water taxi proposed to acquire a 64-foot, 49-passenger Coast Guard certified yacht named Corporate Image that is currently conducting charters and cruises in the San Diego area. The vessel is Coast Guard certified and the engines are California Air Resources Board compliant, which were the problems with the first go-round of the RFP submittals. Santa Barbara Water Taxi proposes to rename the vessel Celebration and offer sunset cruises, dinner cruises, private charters, weddings, and so forth, similar to what the vessel is currently doing in San Diego. Since the vessel is currently operating and would need no refitting, Santa Barbara Water Taxi estimates that the ownership of the vessel could be transferred within 30 days of approval of their proposal and an acceptable lease agreement. Santa Barbara Water Taxi would continue to provide the water taxi service, but would also expand the services available aboard the Little Toot to include sunset cruises and private charters. And they also may consider adding a parasailing operation at some future date once the Celebration becomes established in the harbor. After carefully looking over the 3 proposals with staff, the selection committee recommends Santa Barbara Water Taxi's proposal as being the most responsible and appropriate to reinvigorate this concession on Stearns Wharf. As evidenced by the business plan produced by Santa Barbara Water Taxi, the management and company experience, and the suitability of these proposed vessels, the Little Toot, obviously been operating for a few years now, well suitable for the wharf, and the Celebration. Fred and Kathy Hirschman of Santa Barbara Water Taxi have a proven track record with the department, building their startup business since 2003, constantly adhered to their posted schedule and required hours of operation, weather permitting. And their marketing has proven effective in reaching customers from the whimsical paint scheme on the vessel and the distinctive toot sound as they leave the dock each time. The business terms of the RFP and the proposed lease are coastal cruise business of 1 or more vessels, a term of 5 years with 1 5-year option to extend. The rent proposed is $2,200 per month or 15% of gross sales, whichever is greater. The city's standard personal guarantee will be required since the lease will be with a limited liability company, and the city's standard insurance requirements will be required as well. If the Commission concurs with the Selection Committee recommendation, staff will negotiate an agreement with Santa Barbara Water Taxi based on these business terms and will forward the agreement directly to Council for approval to expedite this process and hopefully get them operating at least a part of this summer, hopefully, possibly as soon as August. I'd like to thank the Selection Committee for their participation, Commissioners Bantle, Sloan, and Spicer. 3 go-rounds on this one. So thanks for your participation in this. And I'd also like to wrap up by saying that Fred and Kathy Hirschman are here tonight in support of their proposal. So I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Scott. Any comments or questions from any of the commissioners? Does anybody on the selection committee want to make a comment? I'm not asking you that you have to. I'm just asking if anybody wants to. Commissioner Sloan.
Yeah, I think, we went through this, as Scott pointed out, several times, and got a couple of different rounds of proposals, and I think, going through it, this is probably the most solid proposal we have. We have history with the water taxing. I think it's a good proposal, and we should move forward with it. So that would be my recommendation.
Commissioner Kramer?
I do have one question. I noticed that you say the proposed term has the possibility of a 5-year option to extend, and but the Hirschmans asked for 2 options to extend, I believe, two terms. Is that a problem?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Kramer, we've discussed that discrepancy with the Hirschmans, and does not present a problem.
Okay, I mean, doesn't present a problem to them, and the option would be on the same terms as the present 5-year term, or would that be?
That's correct. It would be a 5-year option to extend on all the same terms and conditions.
Thank you. Well, I mean, certainly the little toot is great, and what they've done is superb. So, thank you.
All right. Any other comments or questions? So we have a recommendation. Is there a motion to approve? Okay, Commissioner Spicer, is there a second to that motion? Okay, there are 2 seconds down there. Any other comments or discussion before we take the vote?
I apologize. I guess I misunderstood your guys' procedures. I'm from Santa Barbara Water Ventures, and I heard when you said public.
Okay, hold on. If you wanted to speak, I did need you to sign a request, but since rather than do all of that, would you come up to the mic and we'll.
I'm sorry. When you said that, I might have misunderstood. Again, I'm Holden Daniels. I'm with Santa Barbara Water Adventures. And the reason I didn't come up in the beginning and during the public speaking section is I thought that was something that wasn't on the agenda. And this is on the agenda, so therefore I apologize for not knowing your procedures.
Okay.
We, Santa Barbara Water Adventures, respects the selection committee's review and decisions. But we do believe that the commission, all of you, there are key parts that are missing from our RFP. I have a copy of the RFP that you guys have in front of you, and there are key parts of our proposal that are missing from that, a lot of the exhibits, especially Exhibit E, which talks about the rents that we expect to pay to Santa Barbara, to the city of Santa Barbara. And so we would respectfully ask that all you have an opportunity to review our RFP as we turned it in with all the exhibits, all the spreadsheets, all the information, so you have all the information. I mean, this is a big decision. It's going to be a 5 to 10 year decision, and we just want you to have all the information. And I think this is a big difference to this. We all know the importance of professionalism and presentation and having all the facts. And we feel that you haven't been presented with all that. I know there's 3 of you that have seen the proposal and the RFP, but there are 7 of you on the commission, and we just respectfully ask that you all have the opportunity to see that. And I did bring enough RFPs for everyone if they'd like to see it.
Okay, I appreciate your comments and everything, but the selection committee is the one who looks at all proposals in detail, and then they make their recommendation on. And at this point, they have made a recommendation, so we're going to accept their recommendation. And that's what we're getting ready to vote on right now.
All right. Thank you, Chair.
You're most welcome. Thank you. So we had a motion, it was seconded, and we were right up to the moment of asking for a vote. So I will just proceed right there unless somebody has any other comments or questions they wanted to make. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Passage unanimously. So we accepted the recommendation of the selection committee and the proposal as it was recommended. And that moves us on to, and while we have the Hirschmans sitting in the back, I wanted to thank Mr. and Mrs. Hirschman for, because I know they came up and they were very persuasive at the last go-around, and they wanted us to accept their original proposal. And I want to thank you for going around the barn one more time, because I think the proposal that you did come up with the second time, or the third time, as it is now, is far superior to the earlier proposal. So thank you. And we're up to the recruitment process for the waterfront director. No, we're not.
Actually, Mr. Chair, we have one item yet to go.
Oh, excuse me, the Municipal Code 17. I'm sorry.
Recommendation that Harbor Commission receive and consider a staff report describing proposed amendments to Title 17 of the Santa Barbara Municipal Code, and B, recommend to City Council adoption of an ordinance incorporating proposed amendments to Title 17.
Mr. Chair and Commissioners, as you know, we annually review Title 17 of the Santa Barbara Municipal Code entitled Harbor to ensure that it accurately and adequately describes the policies and procedures utilized to fairly and decisively administer waterfront affairs, and provides the legal framework to do so. Together we've worked through liveaboard policies and wait list policies and berthing policies and what have you. And tonight, what I have proposed for you to consider is really under the category of mop up and clean up and clarification. It doesn't have the substantive impact of a major policy issue, but it begs cleaning up and addressing. And that's Chapter 1736, and that deals with parking. And what we're trying to do with this is, and they're very simple amendments you'll see in a minute, I have three primary objectives that we'd like you to consider as part of your deliberations. One, we'd like to eliminate all references to storing trailers, boat trailers in the harbor. As you've heard over the months and years, storing cars and storing trailers is an issue down at the harbor, and because storage is not even defined, and because even if we could define it, it's something we want to discourage, what we're trying to do is keep all the language relevant to parking, how long you can park something, and how long and what the consequences for overstaying your visit, if you will, are. So we're trying to eliminate all references to storing, and we believe that whether that's permissive or prohibitive, just the use of the word doesn't help us get to where we need to be relative to our parking regulations. Second, we wanted to clarify that only boat trailers are allowed in the main harbor parking lot. And that's in the launch ramp, and I'm going to show you a map in a minute. We often refer to the launch ramp parking lot. Well, according to the Municipal Code Title 17, there is no such thing as the launch ramp parking lot. It is actually part of the main harbor parking lot, and so rather than go through a lot of gymnastics and rename a part of the a main harbor lot with all kinds of various descriptions, what we've done is we've tried to clarify where boats can park and define and clarify that location in words so that it's obvious that it's only in the designated boat trailer storage spaces adjacent to the small boat launch ramp. And finally, along the same lines, we wanted to make it very clear both what with permissive language and language language that has consequences in it, exactly how long they can stay there and where they can stay, and really clear up the past. I'm going to show you here in a minute. Carl, if you'd be kind enough to pull up that slide with the language on it. That's all right. As you can see in your staff report, and as how most of it is, I guess all of it is displayed up here, the original 1736-030, the more we reviewed this with the city attorney's office, the more it became apparent to us that the first clause in it regarding boat trailers boat trailer parking shall be subject to the same rules and regulations as vehicle parking in the harbor parking lot was really overly broad and non-specific and more of a policy statement than something you'd expect to see in an ordinance. And the second clause in that statement, reflecting, except the fact that the fees are different, is taken it is repeated word for word in our rate and fee ordinance, in our rate and fee resolution. So that's really the place for it. So what we did was we proposed striking this entire section renaming the next section, which had the word storage in it, with the same title as the one we struck. In other words, trailer parking in the harbor parking lot now becomes the next section, and we've clarified it, trailer parking in the harbor parking lot. A, it describes, going back to what I mentioned to you a moment ago, were our intentions here. A, it describes the fact that vessel trailers are the only kind of trailers allowed in the main harbor parking lot unless approved by the waterfront director, his or her designee. That last language is important because, number one, we have an oil boom trailer in the launch ramp area, and number two, there are exceptions. There are oddball exceptions that we wouldn't want to lock ourselves in. So we left discretionary language up to the waterfront director, but primarily it's permissive language, or excuse me, it's prohibitive language, boxing it in, saying vessel trailers, not horse trailers, not engine trailers, no other kind of trailers are allowed in the main parking lot. The second is the permissive language, and the city attorney suggested that we make it very clear what is permissible. And this suggests that it's you may park that trailer only in the boat trailer designated stalls adjacent to the small vessel launch ramp. And so rather than describe it as the launch ramp parking lot, because all those stalls are marked, as you'll see in a subsequent map I've got. And C is the opposite. No person who owns or possession custody control may park in any area other than these. So this is what you'd write if we had to write a citation. We'd write it to 1736-030C is what would enable my officers to write a citation for somebody not with a trailer parked not in that area. The rest is basically just very minor adjustments, including adjusting the section numbers. And that really concludes. I'd like to show a couple of the maps, if you would, Carl. And I apologize, Commissioner Anakuchin. I didn't realize till late in this process that we have no scale and no north arrow, but I follow my sword on that one. But this is the entire main harbor parking lot with over 600 spaces. North is up, by the way, and east is to the right and west is to the left. But and you see over in the far right is where the boat launch ramp area is. Thank you, Carl. Perfect timing. And those little dots indicate, those squares indicate where boat trailers may be parked. We try to keep the ones that are over 20 feet up against Shoreline Boulevard. And the ones far to the right, you see there are no little squares. That's because those are single vehicle parking spaces primarily used by Sea Landing for their overnight scuba diving trips and what have you. But there are like 76 of these. We check them every third night. That's the rule in here. You can stay 3 nights. It's like a 72-hour rule, but defined slightly differently. And so basically that's the sum of it. We've eliminated references to storage, told people what trailers they can park, where they can park them, and what the consequences are for parking outside those areas. That concludes my report. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mick. Any comments or questions for Mick? Commissioner Kramer.
I have one nit, or perhaps 2 nits to pick, Mick. Specifically, no person on C, 36C, no person who owns or has possession, custody, or control of any trailer. That to me reads like literally any trailer. Why wouldn't it be any vessel trailer? That's my nit, primary nit.
It's duly noted. Thank you. I mean, undertaken. I'll work with the city attorney on this because all of this is going to end up in an ordinance that we'll go to council.
I understand. Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, it's just clarify. And that's my only nit. Thanks.
I thought there were 2 nits.
Well, there were, but
Okay.
I dropped the other one.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, so we have a recommendation that we take an action on this. Is there a motion? Okay, is there a second to that motion? All right, Commissioner Anakuchin, any further comments or discussions? When we make this motion, I'm going to clarify that we're making it with the recommendation of Commissioner Kramer. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? There you go, Mick. Now we're up to the recruitment process for the waterfront director.
Mr. Chair, it's going to be my opportunity to turn this over to Jim Armstrong. As all of you know, this will probably be my last meeting, so he's going to talk to you about the recruitment and the replacement of the waterfront director's position.
Good evening, Chair Kelly and members of the commission. I don't often stand up here, so it's a little different for me. As you know, John's announced his retirement after 15 years, and I can tell you that this is going to be a difficult job to replace. He's done a wonderful job, and I view, in terms of one of my most important roles, is the selection of department heads. And so I wanted to give you just a brief kind of status report on where we are and what I see happening over the next few months, and then also ask you at the end of this to help me out in this process. So first, kind of I'm looking at May as a data gathering kind of process. And what I've done so far is I've had meetings with, obviously with John several times. I've met with his key managers. I have 2 meetings scheduled so far with employees in the department, or kind of group meetings. I will be asking them for basically 3 questions. What's going on well in the department? Where are areas that as employees they believe that we could do a better job? And then what in their mind should be the attributes that I should seek in a new director? I'm also scheduling some meetings with some of the key tenants in the department and asking them similar questions and trying to get their take on what they would like to see in a new director. And I've done this with other department head recruitments in the city, and it gets me engaged in the process, it gets me deep into it, but also I found that I learned some things that maybe weren't readily apparent when I started the process, and it helps me in terms of when you get down. In most cases, what I find in these processes is you find lots of qualified people, and then it comes down to fit. And what's the right fit, and who will fit in best with the culture of the department, the culture of the city will work well. And so it's not just just kind of paper qualifications. It's also looking for fit, which is a very difficult thing to do. So we'll be doing that. As a part of that, we'll also be refining the job description for the job. I did provide you a copy of this job description. So just for your information at this point, although I will tell you that one of your roles that's spelled out in the charter is actually to give the City Council and me advice on the job description and what skills and attributes that we should be looking for. This job description, actually, I was pleased to see that we have some of these job descriptions that you pull them out and they're kind of yellow and they were done 20 years ago, and I was worried that this one went back to when John was hired, and actually we did update this job description with John's input about 5 years ago, so it's actually pretty current. But again, I encourage you to look at it. There's a lot of things in here. And if you have input individually, you can give it to me, but also I'm going to be asking you at one point to then appoint a committee to help me on this process as well. So that's another thing we'll be doing. The other thing we'll do is we will do a quick spot check on salary to determine if our salary is competitive with other harbors in the area. We always do that to just make sure that we haven't gotten out of whack. We last looked at this position, I think, about 5 or 6 years ago to see if the salary was comparable. So that's something we do. We don't spend a lot of time on that, but it is important to make sure that the salary and benefits are comparable to other agencies, especially if there's been a lot of movement. So what my plan is, and in June, is we'll finalize that, and then we'll determine a course of the recruitment. Do we do a full-blown outside recruitment, or do we narrow it down and make it something that's more internal? And so that will be a key juncture that we'll try and reach in about the next 2 or 3 weeks, and then we'll determine if we need to do a full recruitment where we try and approach or attract folks statewide or nationally. That's another probably 3 or 4 month process, because we've got to publish ads in appropriate publications. We would typically identify candidates, and then specifically approach those people and encourage them to apply, and part of the problem is just that publishing deadline and things like that. So if we do a full-blown recruitment, typically it would take us 4 to 5 months to go through that because of especially the publishing deadlines, and you got to schedule folks in for interviews, do a couple rounds of interviews, and then make the final selection. And then typically people will give 30 to 60 days notice to their current employer. If we do an internal recruitment, obviously that could be done a lot quicker, but we still haven't gotten to that point yet. One of the things that I would ask your body to do is appoint a subcommittee, probably of 3 members. And the purpose of that subcommittee would be primarily to sit down with me in a candid exchange, and we call it an ad hoc subcommittee, where you can give me your perceptions of what you believe we should be looking for in a director, as well as your assessment of the needs of the department. I typically at this point will not get into personalities, so I'm not going to be saying what do you think of X, Y, or Z, but instead talk about needs of the department and the kind of qualities that you believe that we should be seeking. I will also ask that committee at some point to give me 1 or 2 representatives to participate in the interview process. And then go through that process and help then make a recommendation to me on who we should select. So that's a critical part. I think it's important that you be engaged in that process and also just to observe how the process goes. You'll have a good feel for it. So that's kind of the process that we're going forward on this point. I'll be happy to answer any questions. I do want to introduce Barbara Barker, who's our Human Resources Manager, and Graciela Reynoso, who's the personnel analyst who she's assigned to work on this. They'll be doing all of the really hard work on this and assisting all along the way. And Barbara's been involved in a lot of these over the years. And Graciela, I think this is probably your first department head recruitment, but I'm sure they'll do a good job in getting a really qualified candidate. So be happy to answer any questions, and I would ask that you, if you can, appoint a 3-member committee to work with me tonight.
I think we can do that. Anyone have questions for Jim? Commissioner Spicer.
I appreciate everything. Could you just clarify what the plan is for the interim before we get the new director?
Oh, we will appoint an interim director, and I will probably make that decision about a week before John leaves. And I find that that's the best way to handle it so that John stays in charge the whole time, and I would expect it'll be one of these 3 individuals here.
Okay.
Or Mary. Actually, I think we all know that
the real power behind
we all
the throne.
know that Mary is the real power in the organization anyway.
Come on, Mary.
Well, I didn't mention that I'm also going to be meeting individually with Mary as well to get her input.
Okay. Any other comments or questions for Mr. Armstrong? So I thank you very much, Jim, for and why don't we go ahead and appoint an ad hoc committee to work, and we can title it whatever we would like, chairman, director, selection committee, or whatever. So does anyone have a burning interest to be on this committee? Let's just start that way. Sloan? Okay. And so there are 3 people that right now have a desire to be on the committee. Does anyone have any? Well, that was 3. There are 3. Does anyone? So there's Commissioner Bantolin, Commissioner Sloan, and Commissioner Kramer. That would be the ad hoc committee. And does anyone have any other request? So I think it's one of my purviews to be able to appoint that committee. And so since those are the 3 people who have expressed desire, let's let that be the selection committee for the new director.
And I will ask, we'll get your contact information from Mary, and then you can expect a contact in the next couple of days to set up our first get-together.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Armstrong. All right. So we have a selection committee. And, John, I think that brings us up to the staff commission communications.
Mr. Chair, the only item would be a discussion about the need or the lack thereof for a meeting next month. I've heard from the chair, who seems to have a conflict for an out-of-town business meeting that he has. I have a business manager that intends to be fishing in Canada, and I have a facilities manager whose son's graduating from high school that same evening. So as much as it will break my heart, this may actually be the last Harbor Commission meeting that I attend in my official capacity, unless there's a burning desire elsewise to have a meeting in June.
Well, you're the man in charge of the agenda. We don't make this stuff up, so.
Well, I certainly could have an agenda, but it'd be pretty sparse in terms of who'd be here and what we'd be talking about.
Well, why don't we let it float, and unless something pops up, then we'll assume that there probably will not be a June meeting.
Okay, and then Mary will send out the notice.
And Mary will, as always, let us all know if we're going to be here or not. So, if there's not going to be a June meeting, I'm going to open this up to see if any of the commissioners would like to make a comment. Then I will start. John, I've been on the commission 9 years now, and it's been we have not always seen eye to eye, as you know, but I absolutely respect your expertise and the firm but understanding hand with which you have run your department. And it's been a pleasure to be on the commission while you've been the director of the Waterfront Department. And so thank you. Anybody else want to say anything? I'm not asking you to or making you. All right.
I'll break up the monotony just a little bit from
Okay.
the standpoint of, you know, when I took over the job 15 years ago, I told Jim this today. I felt completely unfamiliar and overwhelmed because it was a total different career than what I had had in community development 15 years ago, or the 15 years prior to that time. And my learning curve was huge to learn all about docks and piles and dredging and all of the community interests that we have in our special waterfront and harbor and wharf. And over a period of time, I felt more comfortable about that as we went along. And then Stearns Wharf caught on fire, and it seemed like it all kind of crumbled around me because I spent the next 2 years trying to figure out how we were going to rebuild that. But you may recall, some of you, that during that period of time, this room was filled many, many nights when we had Harbor Commission with an active participant harbor community that, in fairness, took their run at my directorship in terms of who was I, what was I going to be like, how was I going to administer the affairs of the Waterfront Department. And as much as we have a few folks here this evening, I think it's kind of related to the business at hand, things have calmed down. Things are far more comfortable. And much of that's to the three gentlemen that sit directly adjacent to me. I might be the director, but as you all know very well, they carry their load and they do a great job of that. And so I've been fortunate to be able to hire these gentlemen. I've been fortunate enough to have been here long enough to know that I think the future of the waterfront, regardless of who Jim ultimately decides to have an opportunity to steer the helm for a while, will go quite smoothly. They'll have the opportunity to continue to work with a very good Harbor Commission. I was reluctant at one point that we expand from 5 to 7, but I've been convinced that was a good move. I think it's added a dialogue and different points of view, and I think that will be beneficial also in the future. So as much as I probably won't return on Thursday evenings once a month to watch you, I told the chair I could probably sit home and have a cold beer or something and turn on the TV and watch anyway. But I thank you very much.
John, that would be like watching paint dry, I'm afraid. I have always wanted to do this since if there's not going to be a June meeting, because this will be probably my last meeting as chair, is there a motion to adjourn? Yes? Is there a second? Oh, good. All those in favor say aye. Aye. We're adjourned.